is Mr. McAdams and why is he famous? Suddenly, the whole world is talking about this gentleman, and memes around him have gone viral, all because of a snafu by a primetime television anchor. I'm Barkha Dutt, and you're with the Mojo story. And let's give you a glimpse of the guest we'll be bringing to you in a moment from now. These are the kind of cartoon memes that are going viral not just in India but across the world. Daniel McAdams becoming a sensation after he appeared on television channel Times Now, and the primetime host kept shouting at his guest from Ukraine, mistakenly thinking that he was Mr. McAdams. Mr. McAdams was made to sit there silently, only saying at the end to the host, "Why are you shouting at me?" Well, we thought we would introduce all of you to the now world famous Daniel McAdams. And before we play out that clip and refresh your memory, welcome to the program, Mr. McAdams. And I am making sure, well, there's nobody else here, so it can't be a case of mistaken identity, but I'm making sure that I don't call you by the wrong name. How does it feel to be globally famous?
Well, it's a very odd situation. I don't think a comedy writer could have written a sketch that funny, and it was funny because it was so authentic. Art imitates life. So I was sitting there feeling like I was being accused of calling for the U.S. to attack Ukraine, when of course my position is the opposite. And as it kept escalating, it became very frustrating. And in fact, I didn't find it comical until the brilliant Indian meme makers started making very, very hilarious memes about it. And then I finally realized it's a perfect little bit of humor and comedy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, they say that you couldn't have, like you said, the best comic writers could not have written this. And before we ask you more, and you're actually an expert, on the situation in Russia and Ukraine. You were called on Times Now to speak about that, but instead, of course, what unfolded, like I said, made this a different story altogether. Before we ask you a little more about that experience, I just want to play out a little excerpt from that moment on primetime TV that has absolutely gone viral. And for many people, it's the funniest thing we've seen in many, many years.
Don't sit here and lecture us. Don't sit here and lecture us, Mr. McAdams. We shut him down.
I'm not talking. It's the other guy who's talking. I haven't been able to say a word.
Yeah, absolutely. The man has gone completely ballistic. And if he feels so strongly, he should go and fight alongside Ukrainians who are being killed.
I have not, dear host, I have not said a word yet. I don't know why you're yelling at me.
I'm not yelling at you. I'm talking about Mr. McAdams. I'm talking about Mr. McAdams.
I am Mr. McAdams.
Oh.
I am Mr. McAdams, and I haven't said a word, so stop yelling at me.
Okay, sorry. I got that confused.
Ukrainian guy who's going nuts, okay? Not me.
Yes, I got that. That's Bodin Nahalo, the chief.
How much have you laughed since yesterday? Tell me the truth.
It does get funnier each time I watch it. It was not funny at first, but it does get funnier each time. I guess I have a slow anger, but I was getting increasingly frustrated at being accused of saying what the other guest was saying.
And of course, somebody at the back end got the name captions wrong. But actually, the Ukrainian guest on that clip does say very clearly in the beginning that why should he be relaxed? His country is being ravaged by war. And so even if the names were wrong, it was quite clear that he was the guy from Ukraine, but the television host wasn't listening. Did you feel angry or did you feel amused? I mean, you were clearly angry by the end of it. But when you look back at it, I mean, how do you see what happened?
Well, I have a camera. I don't look into the screen. So I had no idea that our names were reversed. So I thought he was just not paying attention to who he was interviewing. I didn't realize till later that our names were reversed. It makes it, I guess, even funnier, doesn't it?
It does, but it also shows he wasn't listening because, as I said, the Ukrainian guest was very clearly talking about his country being assaulted by war. Let me ask you one question on this, and then we'll actually switch to something more serious and somber. Today, in the aftermath of finding yourself and actually an international story, what do you think? What do you think of Indian television? Dare I ask?
Oh, well, I think it's great. I had no idea. And I've done a lot of media in the years that I've run the Ron Paul Institute. I've done a lot of TV and a lot of radio. There were some minor debates. There were some minor scuffles, but usually American TV has a boring expert giving a bumper sticker analysis and nothing else happens. I found it very, very lively, and I think it's just terrific.
Well, I'm glad you have a sense of humor about it, and you may as well. Let's switch to what's actually happening, and where the end game of this is as you said, at the helm of the Ron Paul Institute, you have expertise on this. We have a lot of loose talk about a possible nuclear conflict from the Russians. The Russian foreign minister talking about a World War III, talking about how if there were to be this World War III, the war would get both nuclear and destructive. And today, the Ukrainians saying this could potentially be 10 times worse than Chernobyl. Separating the rhetoric and the blame game between the two countries, how do you see what's happening on the ground?
Well, that's a good point that you make, separating the blame game, because unfortunately, war is often treated like some sort of a spectator sport where you choose your team and you support your team. Well, what's happening is very, very different. And what the Americans fail to understand is the Russians view this situation as an existential threat. The U.S. has been pumping weapons into Ukraine since 2017. And don't forget, in 2014, the United States regime changed Ukraine for the second time. 2 times the Ukrainians voted for a candidate who favored better relations with Russia, once in the Orange Revolution and then once in 2014. The U.S. overthrew that government. So the Russians felt they had an existential threat that they had to protect on their territory. Now, you may judge that as incorrect or correct, but they felt it and they perceived it as the Americans would feel if the Chinese installed a hostile government in Mexico and began arming it. The Americans would feel threatened. Now, the other question is, now, what is to gain for the U.S. and for NATO, for Ukraine in this conflict? There's literally nothing. It is not a threat to the United States if Ukraine stays neutral. It means nothing to the U.S. So the stakes are extremely high for Russia, as they say, extremely high for Ukraine, which sadly is getting hit very, very hard. It's very, very sad to see. And the stakes for the U.S. and for NATO are very low indeed, because Ukraine was never going to be a NATO member, and everybody knew it. But unfortunately, they were forced and pushed into a war that I don't believe was of their choosing, and now they're certain to lose this horrible battle.
Given that they're going to lose this horrible battle, you're pretty much saying that Putin is going to get away with what he has embarked on. But what about the sanctions? What about businesses pulling out, Accenture shutting down, Airbnb shutting down? There's now pressure on the IMF to block Russia's IMF reserves. Do you believe that Putin will survive this?
Well, it's sort of the end of the Cold War, the post-Cold War era, the West-dominated post-Cold War era, because U.S. foreign policy and Western foreign policy, every goal that it states, it achieves the opposite by further isolating Russia rather than integrating them into a Western trading agreement. The U.S. is pushing Russia and China, perhaps India, certainly Iran and others, to form parallel systems, parallel IMFs, parallel trading systems. We know the Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. is forcing these countries together. China is not about, at this point at least, to criticize Russia in any way, shape, or form. So the U.S. is achieving the opposite of its stated goals by continuing its aggressive foreign policy. And it's going to have serious economic impacts. We've just gone through 2 years of COVID that have disrupted supply chains, have disrupted production of items. We've had shortages in our stores. You can't buy a car if you want to. That's going to be a tiny blip compared to what happens. This is a global economy. You can't switch it off in one country to punish them without the repercussions affecting the rest of the world.
How do you read this talk about nuclear conflict from both sides?
I think it's terrible. I think the fact that the Russians brought it up and have suggested, and Lavrov is whatever you think of the Russians, Sergei Lavrov is a professional. He's a very sober person. So I think when he brings it up, it means it indicates how serious Russia is about this existential threat. Again, and the question is, why is the U.S. willing to fight to the last Ukrainian for what was inevitable in the first place, which is Ukrainian neutrality?
So you believe that the NATO expansion right to the borders of Ukraine is what has created this crisis? You don't see this as an act of war then by Russia?
It is an act of war. There's no question invading your neighbor is an act of war. But again, we have to look at
You don't see it as an unprovoked act of war, should have been my question.
It's absolutely not unprovoked, and that's objectively true. The U.S. overthrew the government in Ukraine in 2014, as I mentioned. Remember the justification for the U.S. and NATO attack on Libya was he's killing his own people. Well, Kiev has been killing its own people in the Donbass for 8 years, and that's objectively true. That's absolutely provable.
But Russian troops have gone well beyond those regions.
Yes, they have, and I was surprised. I think it indicates how seriously they take the situation and how important it is for them for Ukraine to be demilitarized and neutral, a la Switzerland or Finland or Austria, which is what they would have been anyway. I was surprised at how extensive the invasion is, and I'm disappointed that the talks to end it have not gone as quickly as they could.
You say it's terrible to hear this talk about nuclear conflict. Is there any real danger of this escalating beyond this localized sort of battlefield in Ukraine? I mean, the Americans have made it clear that if NATO countries are dragged in, then there will be boots on the ground. I'm imagining Putin will make sure that that doesn't happen.
And that's the greatest argument for Ukraine to never be in NATO, because if we had made the mistake of having Ukraine in NATO right now, we would be in World War III. So the best argument for them to never join NATO is what we're seeing before us right now. But is the threat of this escalation real? Unfortunately, there are a lot of hotheads in the United States. One Senator Lindsey Graham has called for President Putin to be assassinated, which is insane. This is the same Lindsey Graham who was videoed in 2016 in Ukraine with Senator John McCain, who's now dead, telling the Ukrainian president and Ukrainian troops, 2017 will be the year of the offense. This is your year. You're going to stick it to Russia. You're going to make Russia pay. So this is the rhetoric that the U.S. has been following for years, pushing Ukraine to push Russia, knowing all the time that the U.S. was never going to come to Ukraine's aid. That is a very cynical position for the U.S. foreign policy establishment to take.
But putting aside Western hypocrisy on what invasions are justified and what are not, the fact is that Russia has invaded Ukraine and taking control of a nuclear plant today, going well beyond the separatist regions that it gave legitimacy to. All of this makes Russia the clear aggressor. Now, to that extent, do you not believe that the moral force of this argument lies with the Ukrainians?
If you punch me in the face and maybe I overreact and stab you, that doesn't make me innocent because I stabbed you. But then you must ask, why did you punch me in the face in the first place? So there are many ways of looking at this, but you have to talk about again where it started and how it started. It's not to justify war. I don't believe war is ever justified, but the Russians believe this is a defensive war, a war for their own survival. And as they see weapons after weapons being deployed in Ukraine and aimed at Russia, it's not unreasonable to understand why they felt threatened. It's not to justify it, but to understand it.
Final question. You said a lot about how it started. How do you think it's going to end?
Well, what I hope happens is that Zelensky comes to his senses and understands that his troops are literally encircled, both in the east, down in Mariupol, and around. There's a new pocket forming around eastern Kiev. His forces are surrounded. They will be slaughtered. He has no control of the air, and we know that because the Russians have kept a 40-mile-long convoy of troops for days, and it hasn't been touched. They have no air. They have no sea. Their troops are bogged down in 3 big cauldrons. There's literally no hope. Now's the time to sue for peace, go back to the status quo ante, what was going to be the situation in the first place, which is neutrality, disarmament, and start trading with your partners rather than provoking them.
Well, Daniel McAdams, we had a pretty civilized conversation, and you didn't have to shout at us and say you aren't being heard. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
We'll have you back as we keep an eye on this evolving global crisis. Anything could happen. It really is that unpredictable and volatile. Thank you very much, Mr. McAdams, and see you soon.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.